Hello. Today I'm going to talk about Ireland, the Northern Ireland in particular. I'm recording this video on 11th of June 2026 in the middle of some sort of political crisis, emerging political crisis in Northern Ireland, and several people talked to me with a specific request to reflect on the events in Northern Ireland and perhaps to give some sort of prognosis as to how, in which direction all of this is going to go. The reason they reached out to me because I think that demographic analysis in particular can be very insightful with respect to political conflicts, the prospects of political conflicts in particular. And in the past, they think at least that I have made several successful predictions in that respect. So let us now go to the question of what's going to happen in Northern Ireland. And we now have about 2 days of protests behind us. And I will remind you that the protests started with a very demonstrative and horrific, really, attempt at beheading, perhaps, in the areas, in certain area of Belfast. The beheading, or an attempted beheading, was done by a person with a refugee background against a native Irish individual. Then political violent protests, I should say, followed, and now we are in the midst of them still, as far as I understand it. The question then becomes, what's going to happen in Northern Ireland? Is it the beginning of something bigger? How long it's going to continue, etc.? And to address that, I would say that we need to understand that the political fate of the Northern Ireland will be determined by two opposing forces. And whilst I'm not in a position to act as a prophet, I would say that one of them appears to me more dominant. And ultimately, I think the protests in Northern Ireland will dissipate, like the protests in England, for example, dissipated. Several of them dissipated into nothing over the past 2 years or so. And I will explain in the next few minutes why this is what I think. So those forces that are struggling for the political fate of Northern Ireland are two, really, and you can imagine they act very vividly if you're familiar, if you imagine this mythical animal called Push Me Pull You, I think. These are among the characters of Dr. Dolittle. It's sort of a horse with two heads looking at in the opposite directions. And it's not entirely clear how this animal can basically walk. And the direction of walking is dependent on the predominance, let's say, of a particular head, of a particular pull. So that is Ireland. Only the heads are what I call, for the sake of brevity, tribalism or sectarianism on the one hand, and the other head is the old and aging demographic of Ireland. My claim here is that tribalism or sectarianism is something that promotes, let's say, political violence in Northern Ireland, and in a way that's very different in its characteristics from the rest of the United Kingdom. Whilst the Asian demographic is something that ultimately soothes the conflict and takes the sharp edge out of that. And my guess at this particular time will be that the older demographic will win ultimately, because I have seen it winning in several places in Europe and outside of Europe as well. What I mean by tribalism, there are two things really. First of all, Ireland, the Greater Ireland and the Northern Ireland and the independent Ireland is probably one place in Europe, in the West, probably the only place, where people can legitimately talk and express their political wishes in tribal terms. I think it has been very well noted. If you speak to a middle-class liberal individual from the Western political context, they will see every expression of nationalism with a degree of suspicion. They will not like it. Nationalism is very easily likened, if not to fascism, seen negatively in general. That said, there are several types of nationalisms or tribal expressions in Europe that somehow manage to smuggle themselves as something slightly positive. So Irish nationalism Scottish nationalism, and since 2022, it's probably Ukrainian nationalism as well. Somehow these nationalisms are the more favorably seen by the political commentators in the West. And indeed, because of its ultimately unresolved and irresolvable conflict with the United Kingdom, Ireland as a whole, so the Greater Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Independent Ireland, retained that position, so that is a European nation that practices nationalism, which means practices tribal feelings in general, practices sectarial feelings. That is the normal way in which politics is played in that part of the world. And in that sense, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, I'm not making fine distinctions between them. This is a society that is accustomed to tribal conflict and thinks in these terms legitimately. And when it comes to political expressions, of course, these political expressions, fueled by sectarian thinking, look very different from what they look in the rest of the United Kingdom, for example, in England, right? In this context, there is some sort of, it's a cultural kit, if you wish. Hundreds of people are not killed in this process, but the process take the sharper form, if you wish, as we have seen very recently. Burning of cars, burning of buildings, houses is not something that happened in any of the protests in England and Wales over the past 2 years, and there have been several protests with anti-immigrant flavor in them. So if that sort of tribalism and very active political culture with a degree of customary political violence is something that is part of what Anne Swidler, the American sociologist, called cultural toolkit. It's something that, it's a term that describes how people do things, basically. Every generation and generation doesn't invent it for themselves anew. They inherit it from people. People take it almost by osmosis from the environment, how they behave in different situations. And the pattern that we see unfolding in Ireland now is part of the cultural toolkit, if you wish, of Ireland as a whole. It's a society that is accustomed to conflict. It's a society that knows how to manage it and understands somewhere at the level of instinct that conflict management is a normal part of political life of a society. Now, it's very interesting for me to notice, those of you who follow closely political commentary will be familiar with the work of the recently very central to the public discourse academic, David Betts. David Betts, of course, is a professor of war studies in King's College London. And his path to glory started from relative anonymity, I should say, started from the fact that he recorded a very interesting, almost an hour and a half long video with New Culture Forum on the prospects of civil war in Europe and in England in particular. And there, in that video, he basically outlined precursors of the civil war and for the first time formulated his prediction that at some point Europe will descend to the civil war. It will happen sooner or later. He did not on that occasion issue a specific prediction, a specific prophecy as to when and how it will happen, but in later developments that followed over the 2 years or so, I have watched him quite a few times. Interestingly, he pointed out that the civil unrest that ultimately may engulf Europe as a whole will start in Ireland. He did not specify at the time whether he meant Northern Ireland or the independent Republic of Ireland, but he mentioned Ireland without mentioning any detail. And my sort of scientific scholarly instincts very much synced with that prediction because of all European societies that are known to me. Ireland is the most, is Ireland, the Greater Ireland, the Northern Ireland are places where the tribal language is spoken loudest. Tribalism or sectarianism of the society in Northern Ireland can actually easily be illustrated. And it can easily be illustrated because United Kingdom for a while now has a very good system of recording of tribal sentiments. It is done, believe it or not, by the national census, and progressively better, I should say. In 2021, the United Kingdom had a census of population, and one question that was asked in that census was a question on religion. The question asks something as simple as, what is your religion? And then the response options are no religion, and then religions are mentioned, listed, starting with Christianity. So you may have noticed, if you follow this kind of reporting, that when the results of this exercise, of this census were published, a great point was made by the newspapers at the time that this is the first time in the history of United Kingdom that United Kingdom is no longer a Christian country. And what they related to on that occasion is that the majority of people in the census 2021 did not identify as Christians, as simple as that. How they identified? The majority of those who didn't identify as Christians simply said that they had no religion. And that type of answer, that style of answer, was facilitated parenthetically by the way in which the question was asked. Because when you present the option as no religion as the first available option, a lot of people will respond to that. It's easier for them to tick that and continue with the questionnaire than to look into more meaningful response. And it's sort of a lazy practice. And by astroturfing the no religion option, you increase that no religion group. But anyhow, nobody particularly argued with that finding. And I think, although it had its effect, the very fact that religious life is very mild, I mean, other surveys and other instances of data collection indicate that the United Kingdom, at least, is an irreligious society. Perhaps not, it doesn't lack a Christian cultural identity, but it's an irreligious society. In any case, this result, if is known to you, shortchanges your judgment with respect to Northern Ireland, and that is simply because the population of Northern Ireland answered this question very, very differently. In Northern Ireland, 80% of people identified as Christians. 20% as people who are non-Christian, with one of the non-Christian religions, but majority of them said that they had no religion whatsoever. So that is a very, I would say, striking illustration of the fact that the Northern Ireland is not necessarily much more religious than England or Wales, but it's a society that is prepared to describe itself in a way that's unapologetic in religious or tribal terms. I have spoken for long enough about why Northern Ireland is prone to violence, and it's now time to talk about something completely different, an opposing force. I will tell you now why this violence, in my view, is unsustainable and ultimately will not lead to a lasting political change in the medium term, at the very least. And the two words that can describe that is that the Northern Ireland, and in that Northern Ireland is no different from the rest of Western Europe, has an extremely unforgiving demography. In what sense? In the sense that, like many other Western European countries, by now it's quite an aged society. It's not catastrophically aged, but it's certainly not young. That happened in Europe, and for many of you, I will not be saying anything new, because historically, fertility significantly dropped in Europe, in the West in particular, from historical levels anywhere between 4 and 5, 6, in certain areas, even 7 in Eastern Europe, children per woman, to contemporary levels somewhere between 1 and 2. And low fertility is a really a feature that has persisted in Europe for a while, and it created extremely aged populations everywhere. Aged populations typically don't revolt very efficiently. Anyone who has seen any footage, really, from any kind of political protest, particularly a political protest that includes elements of violence, will associate those acts of violence, eruptions with young men. As simple as that. And so it's not just youthful structure of the population that's required for political violence to be sustainable, executable, if you wish, but it requires a particular demographic, men in their late teens and early 20s. And why is that? I mean, part of the explanation, of course, is biology. Simply, people in that age group, men in particular in that age group, are quite energetic. But also, it's a matter of sociology. So it is some sort of transitional stage where young people's lives are not yet settled. They're looking for ways to express themselves. They're typically somewhere in transition between different types of employment and training, etc. All that is very well known. And it's the most dynamic in terms of lifestyle part of the population. And so the risks, or let's say the potential losses that can be incurred by violent behavior, is assessed by them as relatively low. So that is why, really, and again, I think I'm speaking to everyone's intuition when I emphasize the role of that particular demographic in any kind of political process. Interestingly, this observation that I'm communicating is not particularly new. It has been used for explaining success or failure of different political movements in the past. And one reference that I would like to give in that respect is from the book, I think the well-known book to those who are interested in civilizational processes, history, long-term history. It's a book by Samuel Huntington that's here in front of me. The Clash of Civilizations. It's a controversial book at the time that it was published. It's a book that developed from an article much smaller in Foreign Affairs. And I will quote you what Samuel Huntington tells about a particular role of the young men in the revolutionary movement and social protests in general. Young people are the protagonists of protest, instability, reform, and revolution. Historically, the existence of large cohorts of young people has tended to coincide with such movements. The Protestant Reformation, it has been said, is an example of one of the outstanding youth movements in history. Demographic growth was a central factor in the two waves of revolution that occurred in Eurasia in the mid-17th and late 18th centuries. A notable expansion of the proportion of youth in Western countries coincided with the age of the democratic revolution in the last decades of the 18th century. In the 19th century, successful industrialization and emigration reduced the political impact of young populations in European societies. The proportions of youth rose again in the 20s, however, providing recruits to fascist and other extremist movements. 4 decades later, in the post-World War II baby boom generation, made it mark politically in the demonstrations and protests of the 60s. Now, that's pretty much what I have to say about that. Now, the last thing to mention in this respect is that we have actually, over and above these sort of thoughts and feelings about the role of the youth and behind the protest movements, we actually have figures to substantiate that. And Samuel Huntington and others, and he rests on several compositions that go back all the way to the 60s, noticed something interesting when they looked at the population pyramid of different societies. And they managed to quantify that particular benchmark or threshold that is required or for the violent movements to become sustainable, let's just say. And the threshold is 20%. In other words, 20% of the total population should be in the age bracket between 15 and 25 years. That particular mass of young people, that's the degree of youthfulness of the population that is required to lend sustainability to active, sharp political movements, 20%. If we look at Northern Ireland today, if we look indeed at the United Kingdom as a whole today, if we look at any country in Western Europe today, we will see that the proportion of people in that particular bracket between 15 and 25 is in the region of 11-12%. That's very far from 20. That is also the case in Northern Ireland, and that, parenthetically, is also the case in the Independent Republic of Ireland. The Independent Republic of Ireland is no different. The question then, for comparative purposes, is where and when is this number is larger. For example, you can look at the countries of the Middle East. The countries of the Middle East, all of them, have a much younger demographic. In many of them, in actual fact, in the beginning of the 21st century, the critical value of 20% has been reached. It has been reached, for example, in around between years 2020, 2025, it has been reached in Gaza Strip. Indeed, somewhere in early 2021, I recorded a video on a Hebrew-speaking Israeli platform, and that video was called something like War and Peace in the Middle East, where I explained and I showed those figures that the Palestinian population in the West Bank, but also in the Gaza Strip, in particular in the Gaza Strip, entered that stage, a critical stage in its demographic development, with a very high proportion of people in that particular age bracket. And that age bracket, in terms of its weight in the society, reached the critical value. It's the society acquired a certain risk factor. The violence doesn't have to erupt, but when it erupts, and if it erupts, it's likely to be sustainable. It's a risk factor. You can think about this measure of 20% as a risk factor in epidemiology for the development of illness. It is for this reason, by the way, that I have never been optimistic about the sustainability of revolutionary political change in Europe at all. I remember myself landing in Barcelona in early 2018, and those of you who follow political developments in Europe will remember that at the time something very unusual happened, something very unusual and very interesting, by now completely forgotten, by the way. In the late 2017, Catalonia, as a district in Spain, had a referendum of independence. That referendum of independence was then characterized as illegal somehow by the Spanish authorities, but that's not my point. My point is that resulted in a certain degree of political unrest. And I was scheduled to arrive to Barcelona in January 2018, and I asked myself several times, do I actually want to go? Because at the time, the coverage, the footage in the mass media was such that it suggested that unexpected things could happen. Let's say travel could be disrupted. What made me, what sort of strengthened my view that the travel is by and large safe, and I haven't changed anything in travel arrangement, is simply the footage that I have seen coming from the screens of the televisions. What I could see that political protests, demonstrations in particular, that I saw, simply included middle-aged men and women. There was practically no youth around. And when I saw that in front of me, I decided that as respectable as it is, that political process is simply not going to fly. That's what I decided. You can ask yourself now what happened to it, but certainly the revolution didn't happen there. That is all I have to say about the protests in Northern Ireland and what demography tells us. And myself and we will watch the events as they evolve, and we will see how that mythical creature, push me pull you, of the Northern Ireland, the tribalism on the one hand, and the unforgiving demographics on the other hand, shapes the Northern Ireland's future.